Mighty Marvel Mayhem Show with your host, Kevyn Knox.
Hey true believers, welcome to episode 13 of the Mighty Marvel Mayhem Show. I'm your host, Kevyn Knox. And as always, if you like what you see, click on the thumbs up. And if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Okay, now let's get rolling. In other episodes, we took a look at the comics and the issues and the characters. Today we're going to take a look at someone behind the scenes who helped create those characters and helped create those issues. Probably the most important person in Marvel history. That, of course, would be Stan Lee. Stanley Martin Lieber was born December 28, 1922 in New York City. The son of Romanian-born Jewish immigrants, he grew up on the Upper West Side and later the Bronx. But the true story of Stan Lee starts 17 years later, when he got a job at Martin Goodman's Timely Comics. Now, Goodman was married to Stan's cousin at the time, so there was a bit of nepotism, but nonetheless, he had the job. Now, he was only 17 years old. He really wasn't doing that much. He was basically a glorified gopher. He was getting coffee for the artists and writers, probably not using that, but he was getting coffee for them. And his most important job, he said, was to keep the inkwells filled. But things were looking up for Stan Lee Lieber, because within the next year, he made his way from gopher to actual writer. Now, in early 1941, Joe Simon, who was editor of Timely Comics at the time, and his collaborative partner, Jack Kirby, had created Captain America. Kind of a big deal. Now, in these early issues, you had filler pages, text, prose, short stories written about the characters. And it was in Captain America #3, got his first published story. Now, he didn't want to use his own name in here because at this time, writing for comic books was kind of the lowest common denominator in the writing world. And the 18-year-old Lieber still wanted to write that great American novel. So he didn't want his name associated with the low common denominator of comic books. So he dropped the Lieber and took his first name and split it in half and became Stan Lee. Hence, Stan Lee was born. Now, he kept doing text stories and then finally graduated to actually doing comics. And he even got to create some comics as well. His first creation came in Mystic Comics #6, and it was the Destroyer. Now, the Destroyer was a superhero who, like most superheroes at the time, was fighting Nazis. Now, this is a noble profession, fighting Nazis. Who doesn't want to fight Nazis? Now, the Destroyer did not actually have the splash that Captain America had. He wouldn't be in the lexicon with Spider-Man and the Hulk in Stan Lee creations, but he was his first. Now, it was later on in 1941 that it really hit well for Stan Lee. At this time, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby were arguing with Martin Goodman over the rights of who actually created Captain America. And they left Timely Comics, which means you had an editorial ship open. So Martin Goodman's thinking, why not just give it to my cousin-in-law? So a month shy of his 19th birthday, Stan Lee became editor of Timely Comics. Now, this first run as editor didn't really last that long because war came. And before he knew it, Stan Lee was in the army now. He actually enlisted, but he was doing weekly correspondence with Martin Goodman while in the army, writing stories and doing an editorship from afar. Now, an interesting side note of Stan Lee's military career is this. He was in the Signal Corps. He never actually saw battle. He called himself a military playwright. But in his unit, you also had Charles Addams, who created the Addams Family. You had Frank Capra, who at this point had already won 2 Academy Awards, and he would go on to become one of the greatest Hollywood directors of all time. And you also had a young illustrator named Theodore Geisel, who was doing anti-Nazi propaganda for the War Department. He would later change his name to Dr. Seuss and become kind of a legend. All in the same unit. But anywho, finally the war ended and Stan came home. No, that's not him. But when he came home, he was named official editor of Timely Comics, a position he would hold until 1972 when he was elevated from editor up to publisher. Now, the late 1940s and the 1950s were a big change in comic books. The superhero comic book has sort of gone out of vogue. And in the 50s, now Timely was called Atlas by this point, Stan Lee was editing comics that, I mean, there were still superhero comics around, but the big comics were romance comics, western comics, sci-fi and fantasy comics, teen comics, funny animal comics, horror comics, all this stuff were the big thing. By the late 1950s, Stan was getting disillusioned with the comic biz. He was closing in on 40 years old, still hadn't written that great American novel that he wanted to, and was thinking of quitting. But then fate stepped in. And that fate actually came from DC Comics. That's right. Over at DC, they were reinvigorating the superheroes by bringing back new versions of characters like The Flash and Green Lantern. And Martin Goodman went to Stan Lee and said, I want a superhero comic, and I want it to compete with the Justice League of America at DC, which was the biggest selling comic at the time. Stan didn't really want to do it, but his wife Joni convinced him otherwise, saying, do the comic, but do it the way you want to do it. What's he going to do? Fire you? You want to quit anyway. So Stan got a hold of Jack Kirby, who had come back to Atlas Comics recently, and they set upon creating a new superhero comic. Meanwhile, Martin Goodman is changing the name of his company once again, this time to Marvel Comics. And in the summer of 1961, Marvel Comics released the Stan Lee and Jack Kirby creation, Fantastic Four #1. And it ushered in the Marvel Age of Comics. The Stan Lee Age of Comics, if you will. Now, Stan and Jack wanted to do something different with their superheroes. They didn't want the big, stoic Superman type thing. No, they wanted characters that had problems and issues and fears. They wanted real people, and that's what they created with the Fantastic Four. They went on to create things like the Incredible Hulk, the X-Men, the Avengers, and Stan Lee, along with Steve Ditko, also brought in the Amazing Spider-Man. These were characters that were different from anything DC was doing. And the comics at Marvel in the 60s were different than anything DC was doing. Peter Sanderson, a comic book historian, once compared what Marvel was doing in the 1960s to the French New Wave that was happening in the cinema at the same time. They were deconstructing, they were looking at new ways to write and draw comic books. And that's what made Marvel in the 60s the place to be for any budding comic book writer or comic book artist. They wanted to be there. And Stan Lee was behind a lot of this. Now, Martin Goodman sold the company in 1968 and stayed publisher for 4 years, but then he stepped down in 1972 and Stan Lee took his place. And it was as publisher of Marvel Comics that Stan Lee just made it go from tiny little Marvel fighting against big giant DC to actually competing and even outselling DC. It was character after character after character that he and the others there were creating. Just character after character. It was nonstop. I mean, all through the 60s, all through the 70s. In 1975, they brought back the X-Men, and that brought even more stuff into it. And Stan was creating all these things, not just characters and stories, but also a mystique about Marvel Comics. He made it seem like that was the cool place to be. He had the bullpen bulletins, which made it seem like it was the most fun place in the world to work. He created fan clubs like the Merry Marvel Marching Society, or FOOM. And it just went on from there. And the marketing that Stan Lee did was brilliant and made Marvel the thing. And then the 80s hit, and you had the onset of the graphic novel, starting with Silver Surfer, which was the last thing that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee did together. Then you had event comics like Secret Wars. You had crossovers like the Evolutionary War, Mutant Massacre, Fall of the Mutants. All this kind of stuff was going on until in the early 90s, you had a new X-Men #1, which sold tons of copies, record amount of copies, and then this big comic book boom in the mid-90s, and then in the mid-90s also, the bubble burst. And bankruptcy was looming. Marvel almost went bankrupt. The thing that kept them from going bankrupt was they sold off some of their property to other companies. They sold off Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and stuff like that, which is why when you look at the MCU early on, they couldn't do stories about these characters because they were still owned by Fox or Sony or whomever. Now, of course, the MCU is now taking care of that, and they're going to soon be taking care of even more of that. But at the time, it was the only way to stave off bankruptcy. Now, eventually, Marvel did come back in the early 2000s and created even better comics than ever before and made a comeback. And now, of course, thanks to the MCU, are the greatest company ever. Now, of course, they're owned by Disney now, which pretty much owns everything, right? Anywho, it's all because of Stan Lee. Now, yes, there are some bad things with what Stan Lee did. He took a lot more credit. He was boasting a lot more than maybe he deserved to get. Royalties were being kept from artists. After Jack Kirby died in 1994, his family had to sue Marvel Comics to get the royalties that he was due when he was still alive. Steve Ditko, who had created Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, was disillusioned by Marvel Comics and Stan Lee's overzealousness about how he created it and only had Steve Ditko's help. He just left Dodge and never looked back. Okay, these bad things notwithstanding, if it weren't for Stan Lee, Marvel Comics would not be where it is today. Through his marketing, through his creative output, through everything, Stan Lee was Marvel Comics. Now, a lot of people can say Spider-Man is the face of Marvel Comics. And in a way, that's true in all the advertisements, you see that. But forget Spider-Man, it's actually Stan Lee who is the face of Marvel Comics. I defy you to name a DC publisher or editor. If you're really into comics, you probably know that. But even the casual comic observer, even less than the casual comic observer, knows who Stan Lee is. He is Mr. Marvel. And the literal face of Marvel Comics. He was made into toys. He was actually in some of the comics. He would be a bigger draw at comic conventions than some of the actors who were playing the characters that he helped create. He was a legend. He was Stan Lee. He was Marvel Comics. Even after his death in 2018, he still was the face of Marvel Comics. You see him making cameos in every single MCU movie. There's even that special secret cameo he did in Thor Ragnarok. Wait, that's not right. Anywho, that is the story of Stan Lee, Excelsior. Now in the next episode, we're going to take a look at a comic that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created, Avengers #1. But right now, I'd like to thank you for watching this episode, and as always, if you liked it, give it the old thumbs up. Also, scroll down and let me know what you thought in the comments. And as always, if you don't already subscribe to the Mighty Marvel Mayhem Show, hit that subscribe button. And tell all your friends, the more the merrier. For now, that's it, gang. See you in the funny pages.